Welcome everyone to another MassMEDIC virtual town hall. I'm very excited to see all of you, and I really do appreciate you joining us for this program. It's going to be a really great one. I'm Rachel Robinson. I'm the Vice President of MassMEDIC, and I have to say, joining you all for these programs over the last few months has definitely been a real highlight for me. So we absolutely appreciate your support and participation, and are excited to get started today. I think just a couple of quick highlights. Remember to keep yourself on mute. We do ask you if you have questions. We absolutely would love to know what they are. Stick them in the chat option at the bottom of the screen. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end. So feel free throughout the program, as questions come up, just go ahead and pop them in there. We'll curate those and get in as much time for Q&A at the end of the hour as we can. And I think that's pretty much it for reminders, just the mute and QA. And then I'm going to go ahead and introduce Brian Johnson, the president of MassMEDIC.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. And hey, guess what? We're in December. We're in the final town hall of 2020. So that means we get to wipe this calendar clean, forget all about everything that happened this year. In just 3 short weeks, everything's going to be totally different. I promise. So this is our final sort of all hands meeting of this year of unprecedented challenges, and I think some of the finest moments that I've witnessed of people who, you know, weren't the people who were elected to leadership positions, people who weren't, you know, who were just kind of doing their jobs every day in this industry, who stepped up in a time of great challenge, and I think acted absolutely heroically. You know, I think back to the companies that donated the PPE supplies that we needed back in March. I think about the companies that pivoted to create face shields and face masks. You know, I think about the people, everyday people who started sewing face masks. I think about the people that donated money and stepped up, and people who helped their neighbors. And I just think, you know, there's a time where we will look back on this and we will be, some of the pain will diminish, some of the frustration will diminish, and we'll get to see the incredible acts that occurred. And that's how I like to think about this moment in time, is that we get to live through history, and history is never pretty when you're living it in real time. It's up to the people after us to decide to find the poetry in this moment. But I think this community has stepped up in an incredible way, and I am been so honored to be a small part of how you guys have handled this crisis. And I feel really, really fortunate just to be in the position I'm in, and I want to thank you. You know, this town hall was launched late at night in early March. We didn't even really know what Zoom was. And we turned it around really quick, and we started this program. Really, it was kind of a lifeline for us just to stay connected. You know, we're social people. One of the reasons Rachel and I had this job is because we love meeting people. We love going out. We love socializing. We love networking. It's our lifeblood. And we just didn't, you know, we needed something to do that. And we knew that you guys probably felt the same way. And so to kind of come full circle here at the end of the year, time to reflect, I thank you guys for helping me get through a really hard time. It's been a real challenging journey, but you know, we're still here and we're still fighting, and we're not at the end of this, but there's hope. And if there's hope, there's a chance. I just want to give you a couple of quick updates. I've been getting a lot of calls about vaccine allocations and the decisions being made at the state level, and if med tech people are, particularly reps and technicians, are going to be a part of this phase 1. Or if manufacturing is going to be part of phase 2. I have to tell you, we're doing everything we can as an industry to make sure that our state leaders understand the absolute need for anybody who works in a hospital to be vaccinated. I think it's really important that anybody, whether or not you are paid or unpaid, whether or not you are a volunteer in the hospital, or you are a rep, or you are a frontline healthcare worker, if you are in that position, you should be vaccinated. And I think, no, for nothing, our manufacturing folks who have created the equipment that has kept this country alive, they need to be moved up into phase 2. And we're trying very hard to make that happen. So I hear you. I'm trying to field as many of these requests as possible. We're trying to pipeline this up. We are definitely working on it. I promise you it is on top of our mind. Secondly, just a little more clarity. I know the governor announced what was phrased as kind of a halt on elective procedures this week. I just want to assure you that that order is much less severe than we think. I've received some assurances from the Hospital Association that they're putting out a lot more clarity on that at the state level. This is certainly not meant to be a blanket freeze on all elective procedures. Really what this is about is preserving beds overnight in the hospitals. So, really almost every procedure is still going to be able to go on. The ultimate decision is going to be up to the physician as to whether or not it is a life-threatening or a life health-threatening procedure. So just hang in there on that. I know it's tough to kind of hear these blanket orders and say, oh my God, now what? The fact is that the cases continue to pile up. Our hospitals continue to be inundated, but we are not at capacity. We're not over capacity. But people are just acting with an abundance of caution. And our position is we want to make sure that patients get the procedures they need. Elective really doesn't mean anything if you're living in excruciating pain every day. It's just a silly phrase. It really doesn't mean much. So we're working on that as well. And then finally, if you'll indulge me, one advertisement. We are right now have sent out all of our membership renewals to everyone who's on the January calendar. If you can please process those and get those paid so that we can get your membership renewed for 2021, it would be of great help. We need that in this time more than ever. We still are very restricted in our ability to hold any sort of in-person events. That's probably very unlikely for 2021, so we are very reliant on membership revenue. So I thank you very much for your prompt attention to that. We sent them all out physically, and we're working on sending them all out digitally. If you have not received your membership renewal packet and you'd like to get that taken care of right away, feel free to reach out to me at brian@massmedic.com. So that's all that I have for now, but I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and it's Cheryl Sedelli. She's the Vice President of Finance from the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center. And this is great news here because they have released this Angel Investors Tax Incentive Program, which I think is a great opportunity for our startups and our investor community. And we asked her to come on, talk a little bit about it for a few minutes, and then Cheryl will hand it back to Rachel to get to our main programming. Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Great. Hello, everyone. Let me just take a minute to share my screen. Certainly, thank you for Brian and Rachel for setting up this opportunity for us to connect today. To start with, I'd just like to provide you all with a little bit of context about who Massachusetts Life Sciences Center is. Okay, there we go. And what role do we play in administering the Angel Investors Tax Credit Program? Essentially, we are about a 12-year-old economic development agency tasked with strengthening the state's life sciences ecosystem. We do that by running various programs with grants, loans, tax incentives to support innovation, R&D, certainly commercialization and manufacturing activities in life sciences across the state. And of course, with our partners such as MassMEDIC, our ultimate goal as a center is to try and fill as many funding gaps in the ecosystem as possible, serving as the hub for our ecosystem and continuing to make the state a robust place for life sciences companies to stay and grow. So if you're interested in learning more about the center and our programs, we invite you to check out our website, masslifesciences.com. But for the program that I'd like to tell you all about today, this program was passed by legislation and the regulation was published this past summer. So this 2020 round of the program is the pilot year for the center. The goal is, of course, to spur angel investments in life sciences startups located across the state. And the basic concept of the program is this. Bear with me because it's a little bit regulation text heavy, but if you follow along, I think you will get it. First, a taxpayer investor making a qualifying investment in a qualifying business may be allowed a credit up to an amount equal to 20% of the qualifying investment. If the qualifying business is located in a gateway municipality, the credit may be increased to up to 30%. The credit can only be claimed on your individual tax return. So for this pilot round, if you apply and receive an award from us relating to 2020, you need to claim that on your 2020 tax return by April 15 of 2021. It is not refundable, so if you do not have enough taxes due, you can carry it forward for 3 years. One caveat to remember is that if the business ceases to have its principal place of business in Mass, within the 3 taxable years following the investment, there is a recapture provision, so you do have to refund the credit. In the next few slides, I will go over very quickly the eligibility criteria of what constitutes a taxpayer investor, a qualifying investment, and a qualifying business, as well as a little bit of the application process. But before I get into any of that, I just wanted to quickly clarify the role that we play here. Because this is a tax credit program, it is a program that's jointly run by MLSC and the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. We do not have the funds in-house, and the only way to claim the credit is for the investor to claim or to file their Massachusetts individual tax return. The center's role is pretty much program administration. We run the application process from start to finish.
You're a little sensitive one. He loved his teddy bear.
Okay. The center's role is, again, program administration. We run the application process from start to finish, and DOR will communicate with them directly, and once the awards listing is completed, we will provide that to DOR to manage the tax credit process throughout the duration of the 3 years. And they will assess whether a recapture is needed. All right. Essentially, a few eligibility criteria here. To be eligible as a taxpayer investor under this program, you must be an accredited investor as defined by the SEC, and you must not be the principal owner of the qualifying business or work in the qualifying business as a full-time professional activity. So essentially, you cannot invest in yourself. As part of the application process, we will require you to submit a letter from a CPA or a lawyer to attest to these facts to verify your eligibility requirement. We do have what a sample letter of that looks like when you can download that directly from the application. The investor does not have to be a Massachusetts resident, but seeing as the only way to claim the credit is by filing a Mass tax return, they would need to have an income that is subject to tax in the state. For businesses to qualify, their principal place of business must be in Massachusetts, with at least half of the employees working there. The business must have 20 employees or fewer at the time of investment, has a federal tax ID number, and have equal to or less than $500,000 of gross revenues in the fiscal year prior to claiming the eligibility. So again, this 2020 round, the business must make less than $500,000 in 2019. And lastly, and this is the bullet point that most businesses get hung up on the most during our application process, is that they must have a fully developed business plan that includes a very robust financial forecast, as outlined here. Most of the time, what we see is that the business plan submitted did not quite address all of the criteria, which requires a follow-up from us. Not a big deal, it just requires more time back and forth. Okay. So last eligibility criteria is regarding the investment. It needs to be a monetary investment that is at risk and is not secured or guaranteed. So certainly equity investment is acceptable, and these days investors are using SAFE as well, simplified agreement for equity, and those are also acceptable. direct loans won't be acceptable in this situation. And this program, as it is structured now, is an annual program. So for this round, the eligibility period must be within calendar year 2020. So the investment must be made between January 1st through December 31st, 2020. And the investment must be used for essentially to advance the company for purposes like capital improvements, plant and equipment, working capital, things like that. The investment must come directly from the angel investors' own funds. The regulation did put some limitations, basically that caps the credit as $50,000 on an annual basis for the investor. But essentially, that is one of the few limitations that it has. So, okay. So if you are an investor or a company who think their investors can benefit from this program, if you've had angel investors in the past or thinking about another fundraising round, the application for this is currently open online. You have to go through our website, masslifesciences.com, find the programs page and select Angel Tax Incentive Credit where you find the Apply Now button. On that Angel Investors Program page, you would be able to find all the resources that you will need regarding this program as well. Sample application, FAQs, our solicitation, and things like that. And also a link directly to the regulation. Applications are accepted on a rolling basis. However, final deadline to submit for the 2020 related investments is January 22nd to allow all of us a proper cutoff period before tax filing season begins. And we anticipate that the round for 2021 investments would be open shortly then. So with that said, I think if you have any questions regarding the program or want to learn more, you can contact us. Our website, again, has a repository of information there. If you have any specific questions regarding a specific situation that you have, feel free to contact us via email, angeltax@masslifesciences.com. Okay, thank you. And so I guess I will turn this back to Rachel.
Thank you, Cheryl. And just so you know, there was one question in the chat. If we're going to move on to the other section, but if you wouldn't mind taking a look in the chat, maybe you can respond to that question through that. That would be fantastic. Thank you. Well, I think that it is a great time to jump into the meat of the program. We have a lot to get through today. And what I will, preface this with saying, and Vanessa, feel free to go ahead and start sharing your slides and take over, is this is a high level first conversation about this topic. We do recognize that it is a huge thing to talk about, and there's going to be quite a bit of question, I would imagine. And as this progresses, we'll want to do more programs on this. So don't worry, this won't be the only one we do, but please keep those questions coming in the chat. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Vanessa Pollard, the FDA practice chair at McDermott, Will & Emery. And we are so thrilled to have her and Amy Siegel and Kate Stolman on this program. You're going to get a lot out of it. So Vanessa, take it away.
Thanks, Rachel. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone and to be able to talk about this topic with this extraordinary panel of experts in Amy Siegel and Kate Stolman. So what we want to talk about today is the Breakthrough Devices Program. And what we're seeing in the industry is that the speed of innovation, as you all are very well aware, in medical technology has prompted a renewed focus on ways that the various regulators can remove or at least minimize some of those traditional regulatory barriers to encourage the development and the marketing of novel life-saving technologies. And we've seen in the past 2 to 3 years that FDA has really been leading the charge with an unprecedented level of guidance and activities related to medical devices and digital health, a lot of which has been prompted by the 21st Century Cures Act and other mandates associated with that. We've also seen that CMS has been, reevaluating and looking at its role in creating new and more flexible approaches for payment and reimbursement of technologies. And the Breakthrough Device Program is one of those pathways. And as Rachel said, we could cover any of these topics in probably 2 hours. So our goal today is to level set the Breakthrough Device Program for those of you who are not familiar with it, explore what it is, and also get some key insights from Amy and Kate on some of the trends and drivers, and then the practical realities that companies need to think about before embarking on the pathway. So with that, I'll start by giving you just a quick overview of the breakthrough process for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And then I'll turn it over to Amy, who will provide some insights on some of the trends and the drivers, and also some of the considerations that companies need to think about as they're looking to monetize devices or solutions that have a breakthrough designation. And then Kate will wrap it up by providing what I think is the meat here, which is the insights and the perspectives from a company that has actually gone through the process that sort of ties all of these principles together. And then hopefully we will have time for discussion and questions from you. So to level set, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Breakthrough Devices Program, the goal of the program is to help patients. As with anything that is FDA related, there's a patient-centered and a public health mandate. And the goal is to use various aspects of the regulatory process and the pre-approval or 510K process for medical device or device-led combination products to provide more effective treatments or diagnostic technologies that are life-saving or dealing with irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. The Breakthrough Program is available for devices or device-led combination products that would come to market through the traditional pathways. So the PMA process for most Class 3 devices, the 510K process for most Class 2 devices, and the de novo classification pathway for novel moderate risk devices or technologies where there's no identifiable predicate or comparator for safety and efficacy. Some of the key benefits are why I think there's a lot of interest in the Breakthrough Program and what the designation means. All of these benefits are designed to expedite FDA's review timelines, minimize the complexities, particularly because a lot of the products that are going through the pathway are novel, and a lot of the companies that are exploring it are earlier stage companies, although not all of them. So one of the key facets of the program is that it provides for more frequent and more collaborative and interactive review with FDA. Often the process involves more flexible study design. So sometimes much smaller trials than would be typically required for a PMA. The trade-off in some cases, though, is that if the requirements for studies are flexible as a part of the pre-market assessment process, FDA may impose greater post-market study data collection and reporting obligations to sort of balance that risk. The other aspect is that you get a team of experts that are very much focused on the technology and the sponsor from a cross-functional perspective, and often there is insight and involvement with senior leadership in the division and sometimes in the center, depending on the technology. And the big driver, particularly for companies that are looking for investors, is the priority review. So once you have the breakthrough designation, you can effectively jump the line in FDA's queue in terms of review, which for a lot of products can significantly reduce the review time and the path to market, in some cases by as much as 6 months, but that depends on the technology. So I'm a lawyer and I advise a broad range of companies. So I always tend to focus on the criteria and the legal requirements. I also spent my formative years as a lawyer at FDA in the Office of Chief Counsel. So I bring that lens to it. So one of the key things that I always talk companies through when they're assessing whether they want to go through the breakthrough device program is whether their product actually meets the legal criteria for being a breakthrough device. And so at a very basic level, the device has to provide a more effective treatment or diagnosis for life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating human diseases or conditions. So let's parse through that, what that means at a high level. So more effective from FDA standpoint means that there's a comparison that you're making. And you have to be able to show that there's a reasonable expectation that the device could provide a more effective treatment or diagnosis relative to the current standard of care. And the current standard of care doesn't necessarily have to be a specific device that you're comparing it to, but it could be the clinical guidelines that are the standard of care for the particular disease state that your device is intended to work in. Reasonable expectation is informed by evidence. So this is going to be your data. And FDA looks at two things. Is there a reasonable likelihood of technical success, meaning that you can show as a part of that breakthrough application that your technology is going to work as you intended to work. And then the second aspect of that reasonable expectation analysis is clinical success. And that is whether you can show at a high level that there is going to be a meaningful or measurably better clinical outcome than the current standard of care. What's helpful about the breakthrough process, at least on paper, and we'll see from Kate's experience whether this is true, is that FDA will accept a variety of evidence to support this reasonable expectation standard. It could be published data or literature. They will also look at preliminary data, and that could be bench data that will validate the technical success piece in terms of performance, or animal or even limited human studies to support the clinical success part of that analysis. And then with respect to the prong of whether it is intended to treat a disease or condition that's life-threatening, there's some important, I think, definitions within that statement that are important. So typically for something that is life-threatening, it's similar to the analysis that we apply when we're looking at adverse events or MDRs. It's whether the likelihood of death is high unless the course of the disease is interrupted in a particular population or subpopulation. So examples of these can include acute stroke, cancer, traumas of various types. But we've also seen in the recent months a number of breakthrough designations that are focused on either diagnosing or monitoring degenerative diseases like Parkinson's or ALS, where the challenge is less in the treatment and maybe more in the characterization of the disease or the diagnosis or monitoring disease progression. And then the final prong, irreversibly debilitating, that's focused on whether the disease, if it is not interrupted or treated, will have a substantial impact on the day-to-day functioning of the patient. And so it's based on factors like the likelihood of survival, the degree of compromised functioning, et cetera. And this slide kind of walks through some of the factors that inform those prongs. So that's the breakthrough program at a high level. And now I'll turn it over to Amy to talk a little bit about some of the trends, what types of products have actually gotten this designation, and what that might mean from a commercialization and reimbursement perspective. Amy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vanessa. There's some echo. Thank you. Thank you so much, Vanessa. I learned a lot already from the first slide. So I really just wanted to put this in the context of how we're thinking about these developments and these efforts to support innovation. My firm, Esto Health, we work with innovators who are trying to launch new technologies. So a lot of them are are looking at the breakthrough process and saying, should I go for it? And if you look at the breakthrough program in context, it has a long history. I mean, FDA has been trying to help innovators for quite a while. The big change came really in 2020, 2018 first with the new breakthrough program, which adds new benefits, as Vanessa walked through. And then in 2020, starting in 2020, there's linkage between FDA and CMS so that there's actually some easing of the pass-through payment process for breakthrough devices when they're being considered for new technology pass-through by CMS. So not surprisingly, there's a bit of an explosion in interest in becoming a breakthrough device. So from the FDA's own reporting in 2019, there were about 136 companies that received breakthrough. We've counted about 81 to date that have gotten in 2020. And it's not publicly disclosed who receives breakthrough. So intern Megan Christie, who dug out as many of these as she could from their own press releases and such. So we haven't found them all, but we found a lot of them. So next slide. So if you look at who's applied, and this is, we looked since 2015, we found about 225 companies that announced or breakthrough products. And not surprisingly, given the criteria, cardiovascular products are pretty common, you know, given life-saving and all of that. Also oncology and neurology, those all involve conditions that can be fairly life-threatening. You know, not so much orthopedics maybe, so they had a smaller share. And then by type of device, as Vanessa mentioned, it really is all encompassing of diagnostics and monitoring. There's sort of an influx of AI and software-based technologies, and also traditional surgical and interventional devices. And the mix kind of varies. You know, oncology is very diagnostic heavy, cardiovascular is much more interventional and surgical heavy. So if you look at when people are applying for breakthrough status or the earlier programs that were similar versus when they actually get FDA approval or clearance, that timeline has tightened with the advent of the breakthrough program, probably also as a function of companies catching up and applying since the benefits have grown. But also you can apply really at any point in the process. All that the FDA says, I'm not a lawyer like Vanessa, but according to their website, you can apply, and she'll correct me. I know she'll correct me if I'm wrong. You can apply really until they begin reviewing your application for approval or clearance. So the timeline is quite long when you can think about it. And there are a number of things to think about in whether you should apply or not. Clearly, the earlier you apply, the more the benefits you get of all the feedback and input on your trial and all of that if you're a PMA. But you know, you really have a big window to think about it. So moving over to sort of the reimbursement implications and the pass-through payments, and just to put it in general context, anyone who has a device is familiar that there are, Medicare has reimbursement for specific procedures and DRGs and all of that. Oftentimes, if you have an innovative device, your number one challenge is how is it going to get paid for when you launch? That can be really deal making or breaking for raising money. And so this program is really an effort to help companies that have an innovative device at least have temporary payment when they launch. So there's an inpatient, outpatient component. NTAP is the inpatient, TPT is the outpatient component, where basically since 2020, if you have FDA breakthrough devices and you've gone through all those gates that Vanessa talked about, the FDA, the CMS basically looks in that and says, okay, we have 3 criteria for giving you pass-through payment for your innovation. The first is that it has to be novel and new. We're not going to give you payment for something that people have been doing and getting paid for a long time. check. If you're breakthrough, check. You're new. FDA has already kind of said that. It has to be an improvement over current standard of care, what's available today. And as Vanessa said, that's a pretty key criteria of the breakthrough program itself. So CMS says check. You've met that too. So the third component is cost. And the cost, you know, generally we think of cost effectiveness in terms of getting reimbursement. In this case, it's really, you have to be expensive relative to standard of care. You know, CMS has to say the currently available reimbursement coverage is not sufficient to cover this device. No one would use it without incremental payment, so it actually has to be expensive. And that's really, if you go to the Federal Register, which I've spent way too much time reading through in the past week, you'll notice that the devices that have breakthrough, and it shows the whole debate around CMS's consideration of the pass-through payment, it's really all around the cost, because that's the key component. Versus the earlier, the things that weren't breakthrough, there's all the, you know, clinical benefit and newness and all of that as part of then CMS's discussion. There's still a process you have to go through, so it's not automatic, and there's some effort to kind of move up the process to have a more seamless transition from approval to payment. So, you know, it is a process, but the criteria is down to really essentially one. So things to note about these pass-through payments, they are temporary. It's 2 years plus 1 extension, so it's really maximum of 3 years that you get this pass-through payment. Again, there's lots of things that I would recommend. There's a note here. You go to the new technology town hall that CMS is hosting next week. It's public, and they'll talk about all the different things they're considering in the future. The other thing to note is that when they come up with a cost calculation for what that cost is that they're covering, which can often be quite complex, and I recommend definitely getting a lot of expert help on that. They will cover up to 65% of that. They're not going to cover 100% of that cost that is that everyone comes up with and is agreed to. It's obviously a CMS program, so it's Medicare fee for service. So if your device is not in the Medicare population and you have a lot of commercial insurers involved, that's a whole separate battle. And then, as I mentioned, there's an inpatient, outpatient component. So, so what's been the experience with that? So I showed you earlier how many devices, 136 in 2019, probably close to that by the end of 2020. Even though it's been a strange year, it's still a pretty popular program. So that's a large number. We have much less experience getting all the way through pass-through payments. So I have on the left here the number, the NTAP is the inpatient, TPT outpatient, how many CMS is kind of announced each year as like we're now initiating the 2-3 years of payment. So it's not that many that have did all the way through that pipe to a pass-through payment. And in terms of how much CMS, and we only really see those numbers on the NTAP side. It's a little more complicated calculation on the outpatient side. The numbers really are all over the place. From in 2020, there was a diagnostics panel that was $98 pass-through payment, and then this year there were the first two breakthroughs where they really only looked at mainly the cost component. Those were 14,000 and change and 22,000 and change pass-through payment. So it really is all over the map. Just because you have a less expensive device doesn't mean you don't need the pass-through or that you couldn't get it at the relevant amount. So, but the experience is thinner. So a lot of people are banking on this, and it's still being written. The history is being written on this. So just to summarize, there really is not a whole lot of downside to applying for breakthrough, and a lot of upside. I think one downside we see actually at a conversation around this last night is if you are considering different indications for your device, and getting breakthrough means going down a road of a super niche one that might take you off track in your strategy and your value creation, it may not be the best idea. But really a large variety of companies and devices are going through. So, it's worth a consideration. to look at it. As mentioned, there's a positive experience with the breakthrough to pass through payment pathway so far, but it's a limited history, and honestly even less history, and actually some pretty, that's a topic for another another meeting, some negative history around that transition from pass-through payment to actually some sort of permanent reimbursement. So you have this risk of a cliff at the end of the day. So something to think about, which means that if you go through this process and you're planning on applying for some pass-through payment, first of all, you still need to plan for how you're going to convince your customers to adopt this technology. There's some work on their end. It's not covering all the costs. It doesn't affect all the payers. So, it's not an if you build it, they will come scenario. So that's important to keep in mind. Also that, you have to use that time wisely. The whole point of this is that you're building your data and your evidence to make a case for long-term reimbursement and your utilization. So, it's really a starting point. You can declare some victory, but there's a lot of work to be done once you get it. And also pricing strategy. If you think about it, the whole process of NTAP and TPT kind of drives you to kind of the high end of your price range for negotiation purposes on pass-through, but that might not equal the sort of the market settling price, and that needs to be thought through. So thank you, and I will pass it off to Kate to talk about the real world from the Corvia perspective.
Amy, thank you very much. And I'm hoping that you'll continue with the slide projection. Brian, Rachel, Vanessa, many thanks. I'm Kate Stallman, Corvia Medical, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs. And this image is right from our company website. You can see that the Corvia atrial shunt is a nickel titanium permanent cardiac implant. And some of you who have been in the medical device industry a while, from 2004 until 2014, it was nearly impossible for such a device to do a first-in-man study in the United States. And this is one of the reasons I joined MassMEDIC, is to, sort of share my anxieties with other regulatory people who were at startup companies. Companies like ours went to South America or to Europe to initiate human studies. Next slide, please. So FDA and industry collaborated over many years to reverse this trend, and the early feasibility study guidance was introduced in 2013, part of a program to bring research back home to the United States into the capable hands of American physicians. And medical breakthrough device designation is intended to help companies gain funding for promising technologies. At the time that the breakthrough device designation came along, Corvia Medical was already kind of adequately funded. Our participation in the program was not compelling until that linkage with Medicare payments was established in 2019, as described by Amy. Next slide. So Corvia Medical built our application, and we did it this way to look carefully at the guidance documents and the intentions of the program. Here I've highlighted and read those phrases which we echoed in our application, showing how our device specifically addressed each one of these. And you'll notice item 2 has like 4 choices. There are 4 categories, pick one, but since we could speak to all 4, we did. At the time of our application, we were already enrolling in our pivotal trial, which was a large randomized trial. Our target was, more than 600 randomized patients. So we were pretty far along compared to a lot of companies that look at the breakthrough technology program. So that also meant that we already had more human data to share than a new company would have, because we had done a feasibility study, we had done a single arm study. And therefore, we didn't put animal or bench test information into our application, because FDA had already received that kind of information in our IDE application. One thing that Vanessa mentioned, and I want to reiterate it here, it's really important to substantiate the claims that are in your application, either with your own data, even if it's thin and not statistically strong. Your own data is really relevant to your application. And if you don't have your own data, and even if you have data and it's kind of thin, look for additional references that support your statements. These can come from technical papers or from clinical papers. The references don't have to be about your device, as long as they clearly substantiate your arguments. There's no need to resubmit prior reports that have already gone to the FDA and that they've already received. But as you reference them, make it extremely clear where they would find them in your prior filings. Our breakthrough application was only 14 pages long. It had 28 citations. Next slide. So Corvia Medical is a small company. Our regulatory team is 2 people. And so we have to really be careful about what we spend our time on. Our decision to go through this application process moved really swiftly. You can see CMS announced the acceptance of FDA authorization of breakthrough device as a trigger for technology payments just this summer. Shortly thereafter, we were chagrined to learn that our competitor had already received breakthrough device technology. And then we immediately made our application. Within 3 weeks, we received approval without having any interactive review by the FDA. Receiving breakthrough designation has been extremely helpful to the revenue planning process for our company. And this is really enormously beneficial to a small company, especially, when you're a small company and you're working on your pivotal trial, your next objective is to work with a strategic company, possibly as an acquirer. And the better that you can articulate how you're going to move from a clinical trial position to a revenue position improves, the degree of confidence that a potential acquirer can have with your company. Thank you very much. That ends my prepared speech.
That was awesome. Thanks. And I think we do actually have quite a few questions that came in through the chat. So if you all will indulge me, I'll work through those rather quickly, but we do have 10 minutes. If there are more questions, please, everyone, feel free to put them in the chat, but I'm going to start with what we have. Vernessa, I believe you'll probably be the best person to answer this. You made a statement that breakthrough clinical trials might be smaller than typical PMA trials. What situations do you think that would be true under?
Well, I think it's, we're finding that this happens sometimes with software based technologies where that are focused on a very small or narrowly defined population, and it's hard to get people enrolled in the trial. We find it sometimes in the cases of products that have some sort of pediatric application where there are heightened risks of performing the trial. So typically, if it's going to be more difficult to get a bigger and more robust population, there may be situations where, because of the complexity of the technology, FDA may accept a smaller data set. And Kate, I don't know if you have a different perspective on that. Or Amy.
So my perception is that it doesn't actually change the amount of evidence that FDA is looking for relative to your proposed treatment. I think that the level of, the size of the clinical trial is really dependent on establishing, clear, statistically based evidence that you are safe and effective with your technology. But I think, the biggest advantage that is gained is really in the speed of the processing within FDA, because coming to an agreed upon, size and conditions for your pivotal trial can sometimes take 12 months of, back and forth negotiations. And that depends on, how busy your team is. Well, if you're a breakthrough technology and you get more attention from that team, they have a lot of incentive to move you through that negotiation process more swiftly.
Great, that's awesome. There was a similar question around flexibility in the trials. You know, are breakthrough clinical trials a little more flexible than typical clinical trials? You said they're accepting all different types of data. So is that kind of where the flexibility comes into play, Kate, that you were talking about as well?
So the all kinds of data acceptance is really what I'm trying to say is talking about the application for breakthrough technology designation itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the IDE process isn't really being changed by the breakthrough technology. The breakthrough technology rides on top of the IDE process. So everything that you would need to do to create a compelling application for investigational device exemption are still there.
Great, that's perfect. Amy, I think I have a question for you. You mentioned a lot about how CMS will cover or will work within this realm if the new breakthrough product is more expensive than the current technology that exists. So if someone's coming up with a new technology that's less expensive, it can't be considered breakthrough?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I would really recommend perusing the Federal Register where they talk about the approval of pass-through payments, and it's all a calculation of, basically how much more does this cost than what is currently available, because the case that you're making is that without this extra payment, hospitals or ambulatory surgery centers or whoever could not actually afford to pay for this technology, and therefore they wouldn't be able to pass the benefit of the technology on to the patient. So it really is about it costing more. And you have to show that it costs more.
And just to clarify, that's not to get the designation itself, but that's to get the CMS pass-through payment.
Exactly. That's to get the pass-through payment. That's why they're providing it. Now, of course, that's a different calculation than you're going to talk to your providers about and say, of course, it could save this complication or it can do this thing. And, it doesn't mean you don't have sort of two sets of books for, your sales force and what it's very technical calculation that you're doing with CMS. But it has to cost more. They're going to say, why do you need it?
Great. Okay, so my understanding is this is not just diagnostic products. Will FDA consider any type of product for a breakthrough designation?
Yeah, FDA will consider any type of product as long as it meets the criteria. And I think in Amy's slides on the trends, we saw that, by far, most of them were in the treatment category, but there are a number of the ones that we've seen that are focused on diagnosis as well.
And because those results are not made public, we really don't know how many are accepted versus how many are submitted. The information, Amy, you were able to gather was pretty much sleuthing through the internet. So if a company doesn't announce publicly that they've received it, we have no way of knowing.
Brute force labor. Yeah.
Okay. Kate,
I read an NIH paper on that topic that was written in August, and that paper analyzed 200 applications, and so I think they might have had some help from FDA preparing it, and they had a 70% acceptance rate.
Okay. That's what. Okay. Well, we'll trust FDA on that one, potentially.
Rachel, I think one of the points on that though is that there's a high acceptance rate in terms of the number of devices that are granted breakthrough designation, but there is a perception, at least, and it may take a little bit more sleuthing, that there's a pretty big delta between the number of products that get the designation and those that actually receive a clearance. So I think that's an important point, is that the designation doesn't equal clearance or approval. It just is an expedited pathway. You still have to prove up safety and efficacy to FDA satisfaction to get the clearance or approval.
Yeah, and I'll add that that is the other criteria basically on the CMS side, is that you have to have approval by a certain time to get the pass-through. So some of the ones that are rejected for pass-through, it's because they didn't get the clearance in time. So
that was the next question, Amy, as well, is do you have to submit for that pass-through in a certain amount of time after receiving designation, or is that on a different timeline?
And again, I'm going to get out of my realm of expertise. You do have to have your device approved by a certain time to qualify that year for pass-through, it looks like, from what I can tell. But I think as long as you meet the newness criteria, so I think that would start to maybe get in jeopardy if you wait. There's some catch up where people go and apply for the pass-through after approval, some amount of time, but newness is a criteria eventually, so you can't wait too long.
Understood. Okay, so we do have a lot more questions. I'm going to run through some of these really quickly because I'm pretty sure we can get to really quick answers on these. Kate, the person who typically would handle this at a company is head of regulatory, or if you're really small, the CEO.
Actually, I find an important filing taps every department. Yes, a regulatory manager might be the person who pulls it all together, but these are family affairs, so to speak, and draws upon every department.
And you didn't have any interaction through this process with FDA. You submitted, but it's my understanding that in this program, you submit, the FDA then has a certain amount of time to ask you for clarification and make comments, and then you have time to respond to that as well.
Well, keep in mind that we were doing a pivotal trial. And so our interaction with the FDA and our lead reviewer is there's a lot of it going on.
It's historical. Yeah.
And yes. And so, did we have interaction with the FDA during the whole process? I didn't put that on the graphic. Certainly, I was talking with them, but we didn't get interactive review questions specifically from the FDA. We were pretty sure that they would, consider our application because of of seeing a similar device going through, and also because of our fundamental understanding that we matched into the criteria really, really well.
Yeah. Okay. Makes complete sense. And do we have any idea how much time, or I'm sure there's probably some idea, how much time does this take off the final review process? So if you get a breakthrough device designation, how much does this expedite the process potentially with your actual certification or approval ish?
I've seen and heard, and with some of the applications that we've helped with, 6 months I think is about average, but that depends enormously on the complexity of the device, the strength of your data. There are a whole host of other factors that influence that timeline. But on the initial designation, FDA has 60 days from the date that you submit the request for a breakthrough designation to respond, and then the length of time from that designation to actual clearance or approval. We've heard or seen that it can shave off 6 to 8 months, but that's completely dependent on the product and the circumstances and what else they have in the queue.
Okay, great. We have a couple more detailed questions in the Q&A. So what I'm actually going to do is let's pause here because we are right up against time, and I'm going to send those to our panelists, Paul and Tom, and then I'll try to get you some responses to those detailed questions. But one last question, and just to clarify, have you guys or Amy, have you seen any health and wellness type products in the data that you pulled together?
Not necessarily for breakthrough, because it is that life-saving designation. So I think that would make it pretty tough.
One follow-up question then, would something so in the dermatology space, if you're screening or preventative care, that could potentially be thinking of like a 3-derm, I'm not sure if they actually have applied or gotten breakthrough, but
I think there is some oncology stuff. So I think if it were a very debilitating or life-threatening oncology condition, certainly a lot of the things on the diagnostics monitoring side in there, are like detecting cancers. So yeah, that would be possible.
Perfect. Okay, thank you all for your interactive chats. We'll have more questions coming through, and I'll try to get those to our speakers and try to get some answers out in our follow-up emails. But Kate, Vanessa, Amy, this was a fantastic overview of the program. I can't thank you enough for joining us for this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And everyone else, have a wonderful rest of your day. If you come up with more questions or would like to chat further, shoot out a note to Rachel@massmedic.com, and I'll make sure our questions get over to the speakers. But you know, they are a wealth of amazing information. So have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you all again soon.